Thank you everyone for taking the time to tune in. Um, my talk tonight is called Bodies in Space, Spaces That Sing. And I'll be walking through some projects that I've done, interactive installations and light sculpture projects, and including also some views of the processes, behind the scene views of, of their design, and also how these projects were deployed. And to give my projects some context, I'm also going to give what I'm calling a brief history of media architecture. Hopefully it won't be too long, but looking at some media architecture and media art projects that have inspired me in the course of making my own projects. So roughly there's four parts to my talk. I'm going to first look at, talk briefly and show some examples of the various careers that I've had. Show an early creative project, and then I'll show you the brief selective history of media architecture, as I mentioned, and then I'll get into a more in-depth look at some of my personal installation and light sculpture projects. So let's march on. So first, let's look at a quick look at the career that I have had and careers that I've had and the skills that I've accumulated, some of the skills and experiences I've accumulated along the way. I started off as an architect, went to school in Canada, where I'm originally from, and I eventually moved to LA, and I didn't work too long in architecture, but I did get a chance to work on some like retail tenant improvement projects and small residential projects like this one. This was a renovation of a house in Toluca Lake in the valley north of LA. I have worked and currently work as a UX designer. This is a project for City National Bank to redesign their online web credit card experience. Like a lot of UX projects, this was responsive and it works on desktop, mobile, and tablet. You know, part of any UX project is considering the user flow, the logic of how tasks take users from one screen to another, and how choices are presented to the user. I've also worked at a company that did interactive installations for corporate clients, for trade shows, exhibitions, retail pop-up events. One example of a project that I did, now my role, before I get into it, my role was officially as a creative technologist, not so much like an interior designer. However, my work occasionally did get into physical design. So this project I'll show briefly is, it's a couple of interactive kiosks. The client was T-Mobile, and the site was T-Mobile Park, the baseball stadium in Seattle for the Seattle Mariners team. And we designed and produced a couple of AR, essentially video game experiences that simulated the gameplay of baseball. Starting point for me was just hand sketching, which I still like to do, sketching out and storyboarding the designing the gameplay and the different interactions. One game was for batting and one game was for pitching. And you pitch and throw to a large touch screen and a depth camera. And so part of my work involved speccing hardware and evaluating potential hardware. So on the left, you see a documentation of some testing I did for a couple of different cameras, showing the camera angle and how well they could capture the body at what distance. And on the right is kind of like an ergonomic study of a body doing a baseball action, swinging a bat, and trying to figure how many, what the appropriate dimensions would be to accommodate that, while also keeping the footprint as small as possible. Here's a diagram showing those two installations, the baseball batting one and the baseball pitching one, and also call outs for what the computer hardware would be and where it would go in the overall installation. And there was some, since it was a video game with, live human action and camera views, up at the top, on the top left, you see some testing with the video game, the digital developer that we had enlisted, testing the camera system and the gameplay. And then finally we move on site and install the hardware and the booth on site at the stadium. So that's that's an early view, or that's a short view of some things I've done over my career in the working world. And next, I'll show you a project from my early undergrad days in architecture. And normally I wouldn't show a project this old, but since hopefully, since this is an audience of young designers and students, hopefully this might be relevant. And also this project has some relevance with the later projects, actually quite a bit of a connection to the later projects that I've done. So this was a thesis project I did for my undergraduate thesis in architecture school in Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. And it was a long time ago, 1998. And at that time, I was interested in how architecture can use image technology to create dynamic spaces. And in this case, the program is it's a rave. It's a nightclub, a rave. And my idea was to have like a dance floor that was surrounded on all sides by dynamic video imagery. So these are some renderings that I did that kind of show that. And I also got the chance to do a live test of this idea. At this school, every year there was an annual fundraiser that essentially was a rave, where the whole school building got turned into a rave, and the third-year students would hire the DJs, and handle the logistics, sell the tickets and raise money, and the money would go towards next year's semester abroad traveling, the school traveling. So anyways, every student group to them to decorate according to the theme. And I proposed to my classmates to let me design the whole experience rather than the usual thing at the school, which was kind of like an ad hoc DIY kind of thing. So I made these structural ribs out of wood, and the whole class did this kind of barn raising, and the party would happen inside of that sphere. The skin of so my original idea or intention was ideally to have images all over the place. And I didn't have the LED hardware handy or the budget, and it didn't really exist at unless you had a really big budget back then in the late 90s. So I changed gears from doing LEDs to using a reflective skin made out of reflective mylar. And my idea at the early stage was to project video projections and slide projections onto this mirrored surface, and then see what would happen if it would bounce around in the interior. And quickly, at the experimental stage, I realized that you wouldn't get any kind of image showing up, but I still went with the mylar idea because I had a hunch that there'd be some material properties that would be worth seeing at this kind of scale. So the night of the event looked like this. This kind of mylar reflective, infinitely reflective dome, and people are dancing, and there's a DJ booth off to the side. So the night of the event, the mylar, it actually kind of danced because the music was so loud that it caused the mylar to pulse and vibrate with the music, and it gave what I felt was almost a digital effect, but it was done with real material. And that was kind of a nice thing to observe for me. So there's the mylar, and then, like I said, I wanted the image projections, which I couldn't do on the building skin, or the interior skin. So instead, I targeted it to a projection, a white ball that was hanging in the middle of the space. And so me and my friends aimed some slide projectors and video projectors at it, and that would be the kind of the image source. So this installation happened in the middle of the semester, and there's still another half of the semester to go. And so I proposed a more like a building proposal for this kind of rave image ball idea. Admittedly, it's not a very realistic building proposal like a lot of school projects are, but you can see this idea expanded and kind of made somewhat more feasible in an actual building. And the last thing I'll say about this is that I did consider in this proposed expansion of this image ball system, thinking about materials, I wanted to keep that Mylar effect that you saw in that last video, but I also wanted the coherent image that you could see with LEDs. So I proposed this kind of veil. You see those metal rails that wrap around, and those metal rails would have LEDs on them, and they would be able to blast light through the Mylar, which actually is a translucent material to some degree. So that's an early project, and you can see there's always already an interest in space and dynamic media and large-scale images. So let's look at, if you don't mind, I'll go through a few kind of like my history of, or what I think of as the history of media architecture, and that goes into media art as well. So media architecture comes in, I would say, a lot of forms. This is something everyone's familiar with, this kind of urban screens, Times Square kind of environment. This, I would argue, is also it's a media art project, but it has an architectural dimension. And I'll talk about this a little later on. And something like this, I would argue, is also a media art project. So what is media architecture? I think this quote kind of poetically captures it, at least for me. It says, "Tell me, you who are so sensitive to architecture, haven't you noticed as you walk around the city that of the buildings that populate it, some are mute, some others speak, and still others, the smallest in number, actually sing." So that's where I got the title of this talk, Bodies in Space, Spaces That Sing. This quote actually comes from a short story by an author, and it's a fictional conversation between Socrates and this guy, Eupolinos, who apparently was a Greek, a real-life architect in ancient Greece. A really simplified diagram of what I consider as the formula for media architecture. It's the confluence, to me, it's the confluence of art, technology, and architecture. And historically, there's always been kind of a persistent flirtation, I would say, between all three of these things, these elements: technology, art, architecture, and they create these kind of hybrid projects. So I'll go through some kind of like a taxonomy of some of these projects that examples of projects that I think are important, or at least important to me. So why media architecture, and what can it do? And I'm categorizing these projects in, there's 4 categories, but I'm only actually going to show you 3 tonight. Communication, that's one function. Entertainment is another function. Functional adaptation, that one I'm actually going to skip tonight. And then the third one is sensory engagement and responsiveness. So let's look at communication. Here's a project by an architect who I really like, Toyo Ito. And he did this interior video projection installation called Visions of Japan. It was meant to be a travelogue, kind of like an enticing description of Japan and what the scenes of Japan would be like. This took place in London, I think at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it's from 1991. And the technology here is actually, it's 31 video projectors, back projecting the wall, but projecting down on the floor. 31 video projectors playing 12 laser discs, which in 1991, this was all pretty exotic technology. Nowadays, you can do this with cheaper hardware and computers, but it was a pretty hard thing to pull off back then. So scenes from Japan. And then this project is a stadium in Munich by the architects Herzog and Demeron. And it's got this dynamic colored skin on the outside. It's made out of custom plastic bubbles, essentially, that are backlit. And the stadium has actually two soccer teams that play in it. One team has a blue logo and a blue kit, blue uniform, and the other team has a red uniform, red logo. So depending on which day which team is playing on which day, the stadium can communicate which game is going to go on by broadcasting the color on its exterior skin. Going way back, this is a Baroque church in Rome by an architect and artist named Andrea Pozzo. The church is called San Ignazio. And it looks like a painted vaulted ceiling, but it's actually an illusion. It's actually a flat surface that has a vault, illusionary vault painted on it. And it has the illusion of a curved surface, but also an illusion that it's opened up to the heavens. And, it's a church, so it's got biblical characters and God in the middle. And it's explaining kind of like the order of the universe according to Catholicism, illustrated onto the ceiling of this church. The illusion is it only works when you're standing at one point, as shown in the diagram on the left. Otherwise, the illusion kind of starts to fall apart. Another view of that painting. And then another church painting. This is called Arena Chapel in another Italian city in Padua, and it's actually about 300 years earlier than the San Ignazio Church. This is by the artist Giotto, and this one is, I think, similar to the previous one. This one is fresco painting, so that was the image technology of that day. Pixels, paint. They didn't have LEDs and TV screens and projectors, of course. So they painted one of the stories from the Bible, and it's various scenes that are arrayed along the walls of this chapel. And they're arranged in order, 1, 2, 3 in numerical order, starting from the upper corner there. And as a visitor, as a pilgrim, you're meant to read this, essentially a comic strip, and kind of this narrative, the fresco narrative, will take you through the space in a circle on the floor to kind of absorb the story. And of course, I think there's parallels between the old technology, the old methods, as well as what in close to our contemporary days. I feel like the impulse is still the same: visual communication of architectural surfaces. I'll give you one more church example. This is Notre Dame Cathedral. And another way that churches and cathedrals have communicated visually was stained glass. Gothic Cathedral was famous for that. Almost like vessels for viewing stained glass. This is the rose window. And similar to those frescoes that in the other examples, this is like the biblical narrative shown through stained glass lit up by daylight. And essentially, these buildings in those days, this is like the 1300s. Cathedrals were the mass medium, the mass visual communication medium of that time. This was about 100 years before the dawn of the Gutenberg press, and before Bibles could be more easily printed and distributed. So not a lot of people could read at the time when this cathedral was being built. So the cathedral was like I said, it wasn't just a building; it was a visual communication device. The architect Robert Venturi has said something that I think is kind of related to this. He talks about a vibrant hybrid form of architecture where the sparkle of pixels can parallel the tesserae. The sparkle of tesserae and LED can become the mosaics of today. Architecture as an iconographic representation emitting electronic imagery from its surfaces day and night. So proposing this kind of futuristic architecture that uses media technology to show images and stories and to communicate, but also acknowledging that there's a long history of that, going back to mosaics, to stained glass painting, and so on. And nowadays, this dream of buildings that sing, it's a dream that has been achieved, is achievable. This is a view of the skyline along the river in Guangzhou in China. Another building that has an animated facade. This is a museum in Andalusia in Spain. And unlike the kind of higher resolution screens that you might see in a place like Times Square or LA Live in downtown LA, this is like a low res monochrome animation system. The people who made this media installation facade, they're called Realities United. They're a pretty reputable team headed up by two brothers in Germany. This gives you a more close view of what the material is like. So it's this repeating module that is tiled up to make the wall, and within each tile there's lights that are built in, and they can be animated and programmed. Moving on, and related to that last project perhaps, a second thing that media architecture can do is entertain. Provide spectacle and connected performances. And again, there's a history of this. So in the days before cinema, there was a building type you guys might know called panorama. And it was like a stationary cinema where they had these giant paintings in a kind of a round cylindrical arrangement. And you'd pay money, get a ticket, you go inside, and you go onto a platform to see this giant landscape painting, usually of some exotic view that was an exotic place that wouldn't have been very easy to travel to in the 19th century. So that's one example. This is a more recent example in Las Vegas, the Fremont Street experience, where in the 90s, they proposed to turn a conventional car and pedestrian street, turned it into a pedestrian mall, and then built an overhead LED vaulted ceiling of this kind of arcade that would span the entire length. And during the day, it lets daylight come in, but at night they turn it on and it becomes this giant TV ceiling. And of course, I would say there's a parallel between that and the vaulted or illusionary ceilings from Baroque times. Music, of course, EDM concerts, rock concerts. There's a long established tradition of visuals connected with music and stage design. This is, of course, the Daft Punk pyramid. Down here. Sorry, the volume is a little bit loud. So at the other end of the musical spectrum, this is a skyscraper in Hong Kong that has an animated facade, and it also has a programmed musical performance. And there's a designated platform across the harbor on the Hong Kong island side where you're meant to go and watch and listen to this performance of this animated facade. So the third thing I'll talk about is the idea of media architecture, and more on the art side, getting into sensory engagement and responsiveness. This is an early installation project by El Lissitzky, the Soviet constructivist artist who some of you might be familiar with. A project called Prune Space. And what this piece, I think, is doing is it kind of captures a moment when visual arts was starting to expand beyond the pictorial frame and also expand beyond the wall. So we're moving from painting and mosaics to this kind of like assembly of materials, and then also occupying not just one plane, but the wall as well as the side wall. So visual art is starting to expand into space. Another artist who's done that is this sculptor named Carl Andre. And he has a quote here where he says that unlike other conventional sculptors, rather than cut into the material, I now use material as the cut into space. So making objects and distributing into space. which is also a strategy that Erwin Rettel, this LED artist, has also done in many of his projects. This one's called Matrix 2, and you can see it's this giant low density grid of LEDs that you can walk into. James Turrell, some of you are probably familiar with this kind of immersive color field that you can enter, and the kind of sensory perception that happens when you experience this. There's a guy named Lev Manovich who's talked about how media art and media architecture can move from information surface into something he calls augmented space. So again, kind of like that Al Lissitzky space, moving from a surface of imagery and information to a space that does that. So physical space overlaid with dynamically changing information. The information is likely to be in multimedia form and is often localized for each user. One example that I think fits that description is this interactive installation by an artist named Scott Snibbe. And it's called Boundary Functions. And you'll see why it's called Boundary Functions. So there's a projector overhead and it detects where people are standing, and it produces a live division line between however many people are there. It's basically a Voronoi diagram, and it produces a Voronoi diagram based on how many people are in that territory. Before I leave these example projects, I want to talk a little bit about some of the hardware that is commonly used for media architecture: display screens, video projections, and projection mapping. In media art and media architecture, and potentially looking beyond the screen. So this image you guys have probably seen before. It's from Blade Runner. This was kind of like a dream image for architects and designers for a long time. At least it was when I was in architecture school. The technology didn't exist to be able to do this, to have this large multi-story electronic billboard. And so this dream has kind of animated a lot of designers over the years. And it's another example of the information surface that Lev Manovich talks about. So there's always been a dream for architects and artists to do large scale images, but it's not a dream, from today, and it's not just from Blade Runner. It goes back, and an earlier example would be the architect's Archigram, who proposed fictional buildings that had a lot of an optimistic view of technology and space frames, construction, and a lot of display screens. Another example here from Archigram. And so in the late 60s, when Archigram was proposing this, the technology didn't exist to do this. So this was, literally imaginary, but they were envisioning a future where this would be possible. A similar project is the Pompidou Center Museum in Paris, which some of you, again, might be familiar with. This is the competition drawing, which won the competition. This is the elevation view by the architects Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers. And in their proposal, they proposed this flexible, kind of like a display space for art within the building, but also on the facade, they proposed these what they called interactive information facade. Essentially, the video screens that we're familiar with, the urban scale video screens we're familiar with today. But when they built it in the 70s, that technology didn't exist. So they had to go without the screens. That got dropped from the project pretty early. And I think even today, they just hang banners on the facade. Of course, today, the idea of urban scale video screens is something achievable, and you see it, all over major cities in the world. And there's off-the-shelf hardware that can do this now. So a recent example is this facade in Seoul. This is I think it's a combination shopping mall and a concert hall from what I've read, and it's got this high-res LED screen that wraps around two walls, and similar to that Andrea Pozzo trompe-l'oeil, I didn't mention that word, trompe-l'oeil, the illusionary painting on the ceiling in that church. Here we have this kind of forced perspective animation, this 3D effect on a high-res screen in a screen that wraps around a corner. And artists have also done this. This is Refik Anadol, a atrium project that he did in San Francisco, where the animation on screen is powered or animated by apparently by live data from San Francisco environment. So wind trajectories, maybe traffic data. And again, it's a screen that wraps around a corner. There's another project that he's done. One thing that I think is interesting to point out is that these projects are self-described as data sculptures. And there's definitely data in it, I would say, animating the content on the screen. But whether it's sculpture or not, I think maybe is up for grabs. Is a screen sculpture? Maybe it is, but I think there's also other ways to approach the idea of sculpture and tactile artworks. And high-res screens have also been in galleries for a long time. Video art, that is a long tradition, and then now NFT art is using screens. Quick look at video projections. So this is a project by Team Lab, a Japanese team Japanese multimedia company that does these immersive video projection environments, interactive as well. And I think video projections are, they're obviously really great at coding a surface, and you can really change the environment and the feel of a space with projections. But where I think I would argue where it falls short is the inevitable shadows that video projections produce when as soon as the participant or the spectator walks into the firing line of the projector. And you can see that in these two images here. So we have video projections, we have LED screens, and those are often used in media art and media architecture nowadays. Not everyone's doing it, but it's a popular choice. In my case, I've chosen, for now at least, to stay with physical material and their effects and their inherent properties of these physical materials, and also combine them with digital media hardware and programming. And to me, that's kind of a territory that I'm interested in, where it's physical and it's digital at the same time. And I think that combination can kind of go beyond the parameters of the flat screen. And instead of using a TV in the projects that I'll be showing you, I'm essentially building a custom TV in some cases. So here's one example of what I like to think of as material effects. Here's another example of one of my projects, and here's another example. This particular project is it's a fiber optic chandelier that you could walk into, and I call it animate field. And I'll go through this project in some depth, as well as the next few projects. So I developed this at first when I was at UCLA Design Media Arts. This was my final thesis project. My thesis advisor was the artist Rebecca Mendez, and a few other really talented faculty there, Christian Moeller, and a few others. So it's this hanging chandelier, and you can walk into it. And when you walk into it, the colors change from the default red to this yellow that surrounds you. So your presence is acknowledged. And as you move through the space, you kind of create a trail of color behind you that eventually dissipates and disappears. So there's also video involved with this. There's a video projector that is the light source for this. And in a way, I think of this as it's like a architectural skin, and it's like a display screen, excuse me, since it's video, but it's an attempt to disperse and atomize the display screen. So it's not just a flat plane, but it's kind of spread out into space. Here's another view. And one thing I noticed, this project is, when it's installed and people are using it, it's interesting to observe people walking into it, or people apprehending it. I noticed that older people tend to, or more reserved people tend to stay kind of at the edges or at the exterior wall and kind of like look at it as a piece to look at. But younger people, especially kids, like to actually walk in. And in this case, a couple of people chose to lie down and look up at the stars in the sky. So this project, I've been lucky that it's been invited to show a few different places after its initial life at school. So this was an installation in a building in downtown LA. And this gives you an idea of the assembly process on site. So it starts off with a rack, ceiling mounted rack, and some hardware, including the projector that gets installed in the ceiling. And then there's some panels that hold all the fiber optic threads. Those get put into place into the upper frame, and then you turn on the computer and the camera, and then the system works. I also got to show this in Paris at a like a digital art museum. There's a couple of views of that here, kids playing in it. And last year I got asked to actually to remake the project because I'd thrown it out. The fibers had worn out from showing it a few times and having people walk through it. So I had to remake it, and then I got a chance to show it again in France. So this is, again, the default view. And then when people walk into it, it creates these trails of light. And here's a video that kind of shows how it works. So when you walk into it, it's this kind of star field, and the fibers kind of graze your skin, and you kind of push them aside like a beaded curtain. And when you enter it, the colors change according to your position. So it's like this halo that follows you around. And here's a school group of kids. Like I said, kids seem to really enjoy this, and yeah, they're just going wild here. And so when you leave the fibers, the colors eventually the yellow color dissipates and it fades back to the original red. So it's like a ghostly fading reminder of where you've been. So let's look at I'll show you some footage of the development of this piece. An early sketch here where I was thinking of the kind of overhead canopy with lights that would light up over you. And I got as far as building a prototype of this. And you can see so there I am walking, and then when I get close enough, then the system detects your presence and it lights up overhead. And these are, unlike the fibers that I eventually went with, these were individually wired LEDs. And in terms of production, it just took too long. It would take too long for me to make a large enough scale version of this to fill up a room. So I moved off of the LEDs and went to the fiber optics. Another sketch, there was an idea I had to kind of make a floor to go with this overhead canopy as well. So it would be this kind of oozing womb kind of organ shape that you would crawl into. Another sketch, this one shows that diagonal slope, which eventually stayed in the final version of the project. So this slope of lights that you walk into, I was aiming for this sensation where, kind of like walking into the ocean when you're at the beach, where the water level rises and rises as you walk into it. And the same thing, or maybe the opposite thing, happens in this piece. In terms of the technology hardware configuration, this is a simple sketch showing how this works. So there's a USB camera up above that can see when people walk onto the floor. And then that information, that image gets fed to the computer, which is running a software sketch that I put together in processing. And in real time, it detects where people are, and it'll draw a color blob, in my case, yellow, and then project that image along with the red, project it through a video projector, and then that gets projected and fed into the bundle of fibers that's held up at the top. So it's kind of this closed loop system. a more resolved drawing showing what that looked like. In this 3D view, you see at the top there, you see the kind of rack holding the individual frames, essentially the window screen panels. And each panel of these window screen panels had fibers running into it, and each panel was numbered. And they were numbered because each specific fiber had a specific length. And from that 3D model that you saw a second ago, a friend of mine was able to do some really crafty coding, way beyond my talents with coding and scripting. And the coding was able to spit out a spreadsheet of numbers of the length of each fiber in inches and put it in a spreadsheet, which you see on the right here. I call it the spreadsheet from hell because it's 3,000, I think over 3,200 fibers, and they had to be individually measured and cut and then arranged into the frames. This is a kind of factory line, assembly line that I devised for cutting and measuring and cutting those fibers and putting them into the frames. The frames, like I mentioned earlier, were actually just really simple. It's just window screen panels that you can get at any hardware store. So this time lapse shows this kind of measure and cut and thread process. This is me and my girlfriend who very thankfully helped me this day. So it's two people measuring, cutting, and threading, and doing that for a long time to eventually build up this body of over 3,000 fibers. This is what some of the hardware looked like when I was still the first version of this when I was in school. The projector and the fibers all bundled up. You see it on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you see the processing sketch running on the computer, and then I'm walking around underneath the camera, and you can see it's kind of drawing a color blob on screen where I'm moving around. I've upgraded since then. I've upgraded some of the physical hardware. It's a little bit stronger and it travels easier. And this is another view. So there's a projector, and then you can see there's fibers that are connected to the bottom of this box. And there's a mirror, which acts like a periscope to bounce the projector beam onto those fibers that you see there, the fiber endpoints that are pointing up on the right-hand side. Speaking of the fibers come off of a reel, as you kind of saw in the fiber reel in the assembly diagram. And when you unroll it, it comes with a natural curl. And at first I wanted to defeat the curl because my original intention was to have the fibers hanging straight, but they already come from the factory with a curl. And I experimented a little bit. I don't have any pictures of it, but I experimented with attaching fishing weights to hold it down straight. And it still wasn't holding it very straight. So I eventually just went with the curl, and I figured I'd go with the kind of the natural state of the material. However, when I redid this project last year, I since did some research, which I should have done back then. But apparently you can straighten curled fiber optic threads by soaking them in boiling water and then cooling it in cold water. So that's what I'm doing here. And here you see the comparison between the curled fibers on the left and then the straightened fibers on the right. It's still not really straight because I couldn't soak the entire length of the fibers. I didn't have a body of a tube that was 8 feet long, but it's still straighter than what it would have been if I just left it alone. So in spring of last year, I had to start packing this project and shipping it to France. So all those fiber panels would go into a box. There's all the boxes ready for shipping, and I sent them over. And when I got on site in France at the museum, there was a staff. There's a technical staff that could help me with some of the installation, which you kind of see on the left here. On the right, another view of the camera and computer software system. I'll talk a little bit. I don't want to go too long. I know this is taking a while already. Hopefully you guys don't mind, but I'll talk a little bit about the institution. So it's called Syntax, in French, Syntax Culture Numérique. So Syntax is the name, and then Culture Numérique means digital culture. So in France, this is kind of interesting. Throughout the country, in almost every town of a certain size, there is one of these kind of institutions, which is it's a museum. It's a curated museum, but it's also a STEM digital arts center. So about half of the space in here is devoted to a maker lab fabrication lab, and they'll have, you know, people of all ages, including school kids, come over to learn 3D printing or learn how to make VR content. And you can see that kind of explained in the poster on the right. And they're well funded. It's like a government thing that's throughout the country. They'll have these kind of digital arts centers, which I think is a great thing, and I wish we had in this country. So another installation view in that museum in France, in a city called, by the way, the city called Reims in English, or Reims in French. And this is me gradually installing the panels. This is the view from on top of the ladder, and you can see there's like a crazy jumble of fibers. And a lot of the work was, for me at least, was organization and just keeping track of each fiber and bundling them, organizing them, making sure it doesn't become even more of a crazy mess. Here's those diagrams. I pinned them on the wall, and those would be constantly referred to as we were assembling it on site. All those fibers, I mentioned earlier, each panel has an individual number, and that number is labeled up at the other end where the fibers connect to the projector, and you can see the labels there. Here's turning on the projector, so the fibers are beginning to get lit up. And then over time, more and more of the fibers are installed, and then finally it gets turned on. And that's what it looks like when it's finished and when someone's walking into it. So that's this project, Animate Field. And I'll show you another project. It's also from school, but hopefully, since you guys are students, you don't mind seeing another school project. This one was actually pretty important to me as well. Which is why I chose to show it. This project came from a very unique class. It was a joint class between the UCLA Architecture School, which I had also attended, and the UCLA Design Media Arts School. And at that time, I was a student. I'd already graduated from the architecture school, but I was a student at this point in the media arts school. The project was to design an interactive storefront installation that would go into the facade windows at the sidewalk level of this art gallery in Hollywood called Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, or LACE for short. The class was configured as basically a design competition. So teams of students, 3 students per team, and we would make proposals for this site. And this was right before the economic crash of 2008. So there was an ample, generous budget. So the winning proposal would get a budget to actually build this in Hollywood, and for the materials, and to build it actually and have it as a real life project, which is something that you don't always get in school. The building, the Lace Gallery, looks like this on its own, conventional kind of commercial architecture windows, or something you'd see for a retail store. A little bit about the environment. You guys are probably familiar, Hollywood Boulevard, the Walk of Fame. So it's kind of a tourist environment at street level on Hollywood Boulevard, which is an interesting contrast to the art gallery, essentially a fine art gallery in the middle of this kind of schlocky tourist area. So the assignment we were given was to produce an installation, an interactive installation, architecture and media arts, that would address these 2 different communities and 2 different audiences: the fine arts kind of environment in the gallery, and then the kind of pedestrian tourist street life on the outside. Here's another view of it, getting a little closer. So it was made out of these custom panels that we designed and vacuum formed, and there was also some interactive lights and data displays. Those blue little screens that you see here, those are text display screens. And when you're on the street, the screens that are on the street play a data animation, text animation, showing the mind from the history of artists and gallery shows or art exhibits that have taken place in the history of Lace Gallery. So, you know, a show in 2005, and it shows the name of the art exhibit as well as the name of the artist. And you can see this kind of light, the white light that's above and below this kind of blade that's holding, this white blade that's holding the LCD. So that white light, it's visible from the inside. So this is a view from inside the gallery, another view. And that white light actually dims when you, on the street level, on the street side, when you lean in to read it. And you'll see that in the video. Those display screens are also, let me go back here, they're also visible. There's some screens that are angled to face the inside. So when you're standing inside the gallery, it also shows information, but it doesn't show information about the gallery because you're already standing in the gallery. Instead, it shows information from the street. So the curator of the gallery at this time got us in touch with this artist that she knew who had done a project where he went around to Hollywood Boulevard, exactly where this project is cited, and gathered some quotes and interviewed very random people on the street, tourists, parking lot attendants, local workers. And so the data that you read when you're inside the gallery is actually data from people out on Hollywood Boulevard. And diagrammatically, again, when you're standing on Hollywood Boulevard and you're reading the displays, you're learning about the gallery on the other side of the building skin. But then when you're inside, you're conversely reading about the Hollywood Boulevard street environment outside. So whichever side you're standing on, in a way, you're kind of getting a view or being pulled into the other side. The name openings, I should mention, has a couple of meanings. So you see these apertures where these panels come together. There's an aperture, an opening that's formed. And so that's openings. And then we're also thinking of art gallery openings. So there's kind of a dual meaning that acknowledges at least one of the audiences in this. Here's a assembly diagram showing those materials. And here's a video. And I'll just let this play, and it'll show some of the dynamic behavior and the animations of this project. So the white lights, the top rows and the bottom rows, those are tuned to detect pedestrians when they're walking by. And it's kind of subtle, but you can see that the lights dim a little bit whenever someone's in front of them. You see the blue screens animating. That's part of when the data animation cycles, it flashes. And so here, when someone looks at the data screen, when they lean in, that white light dims, and you kind of saw that right there. And then they get to read, as I said, read about the gallery. Let's skip forward a little bit, if you don't mind. So this is the view from the inside. And as I mentioned earlier, the top and the bottom rows of LEDs, those are tuned to detect the presence of pedestrians when they walk by. So we consider this a passive form of interaction where people don't really know that they're doing anything. It's not like pressing a button, but when they walk by, they're actually causing a reaction on the building skin. And as I said earlier, when you're on the inside, the LCD screen plays quotes and information about people in the neighborhood. So this was our team. In the middle there is the professor who led the class, architect David Erdman, and then had a couple of partners. And I should have said this earlier, a three-person project. It was myself, it was a student named Andrea Beck on the left, and then Jian Kim on the right. I'll talk a little bit more about them later on, but in this class, I'll try to go through this quickly. We developed prototypes every week. And here you see Jian doing some wiring and programming for the prototype on the left. And then on the right, you see some of the hardware. It's a couple of Arduino boards that power the LCD text display screens. Here's a view of the final prototype. It's unlike a lot of architecture school projects where you design, a scaled down model. This is full scale, 1-to-1. It's just truncated. So it's not, 8 feet tall, but it shows like a 6 or maybe 5.5 foot tall version at full scale using the real materials. So I mentioned that we had a a project budget for the materials, our proposal won. And as part of, aside from getting the project proposal, we also got a trip to Hong Kong, if you can believe it, which sounds kind of like a game show prize, but there was a travel budget. So we went to Hong Kong for the purpose of buying the LED and sensor and electronic hardware, because the choices are better in Hong Kong. There's street markets that sell electronic hardware like LEDs, and also to research the kind of local variety of interactive building facades. And there's more of them in Asian cities like Hong Kong than there are, at least back then, than there are in North American cities. So this was the team. This is kind of like our rock band photo at the peak in Hong Kong. Jian on the left was the full-fledged media arts student, and her interests were coding, programming, and data, which is perfect. And you saw the text data in this project. And then Andrea on the right, she's the full-fledged architecture student, and she did most of the like the 3D design for this project. We bought some LCDs, and here at that time the choice of LCD hardware was much better in Asia. And I happened to buy these on eBay, and I bought them about a week before we went to Hong Kong, but it turned out that the vendor is actually in Hong Kong anyway. So instead of having him ship them to me, I told him that I'd pick them up when I was there. And on the right, you see the transaction. It was kind of like a drug deal at the subway station, where he brought the goods and I brought an envelope of cash, and then we both inspected our respective items, and then we finished the transaction. Here's the LEDs, beginning to wire them up. We set up kind of like a mini sweatshop in the school, the three of us doing all the soldering. And this is a custom 3D printed holder for those LCD displays. And then moving on site, we started to do some testing on site at the museum, at the gallery. Here you see the sensor. It's an infrared sensor. You can see in the back of that triangular shaped object, and you see the LEDs. And then there's a rectangular hole for the LCDs to go into. More assembly, a lot of wires. And this is what it looked like finally when it was complete. So one more project. This is a brief one. This one I call Water Clouds of Light. It's a light installation reusing water jugs, the kind of water jugs that you can get at the supermarket that has a spout. So a classmate of mine, he drank water and he saved these bottles or these jugs by his desk, and he didn't have any intentions for them. So I asked if I could use them. So I took them and made them into a light sculpture. And they're animated by these kind of like ramping up and down, breathing LED lights. It's pretty simple. There isn't, they're just randomly patterned, but it kind of creates this atmosphere of like constantly changing light. And it also has the benefit of reusing what is essentially like a disposable plastic product. Here's another version of an installation. Here's another piece that I've made. This one was not, this is an independent project I made outside of school. So this one I call Polymer. And it's, instead of using water jugs, this one uses contact lens trays. And so some years ago, my optometrist I wear contact lenses, and she switched me to disposable contact lenses. And they're daily disposable. So every day I'm essentially throwing out 2 of these plastic shells. And I thought that was kind of wasteful. You know, I try to recycle them, but you never know when you put it in the recycling stream, you never know if it actually gets recycled. So I saved them. And, you know, I was mindful of the issue of ocean plastic pollution, like where does all this plastic go? We now know that a lot of it ends up in the ocean. So I took all these shells and I arranged them into this low-res display screen. And it looks like this. And the trays are arranged and held in place by these custom 3D printed holders that hold, I'll explain them a little bit more later, I'll show them, but they hold the LED and the contact lens tray in place. And so this video shows what that looked like in action. So here's those contact lens trays being accumulated. And when they're put together in front of the LEDs, then there's this white low-res animation that plays on it. And the animation that's playing on it is actually ocean waves that I had filmed, I think at Washington Pier in Venice. So by watching an animation of ocean waves on a surface of disposable plastic, it's an attempt to connect the two to kind of remind people of the issue of ocean plastic pollution. So as I mentioned, those contact lens trays needed to be held in place to make that kind of square grid. And I came up with the idea of designing and 3D printing a custom holder. And here you see some views. It was modeled in Rhino. I modeled it in Rhino. And then at that time where I worked, they had a 3D printer on the premises. So after hours, I was allowed to go in there and use the 3D printer. And it was a lot of iteration. Here you see some of the prints that I made. This is version 12. This is version 22. And with each evolution, I'm trying to make it stronger and also trying to make it more efficient and use less material. So to reduce the cost and increase the strength as I go. This is version 33, excuse me, which was the final version. Some of the hardware, this is a PCB board on the left that was off the shelf that kind of like a light bright, it powers LEDs that usually are plugged right into the board. But in my case, I'm wiring the LEDs to the board so that I can spread out disperse the LEDs. Similar to the fiber project where I'm dispersing all those pixels, this is dispersing the LEDs. The software runs again in processing. There's an Arduino board involved as well. So yeah, the computer runs processing, like I said, and it connects by USB to an Arduino board that is embedded into that larger PCB, the LED board. And the diagram on the right kind of shows roughly the hardware configuration. Here's some sketches that I did in the process of building the enclosure, the hardware. Also 3D modeled, and I went into the wood shop and built this enclosure. This axle diagram shows kind of the layering of materials, the contact lens trays on the outer surface, and then behind that is those 3D printed holders, and then behind that is kind of a wooden slat system, which those 3D printed holders are screwed to, and then all of that magnetically clips into the larger frame. The contact lens trays themselves. So I had to modify them a little bit in order to get the lighting effect that I wanted. So on the left, the green background image at the bottom left here. So on the very left of that, you see a contact lens tray originally what it looks like, and it's kind of translucent, but it wasn't translucent enough to diffuse the light for what I wanted to kind of make a nice haze of light for each LED rather than seeing the hard naked LED bulb. So I thought of sandblasting these trays. In the middle, you see an example of a sandblasted one. And after it got sandblasted, I noticed that it took on kind of a yellowish tinge. I think because the sand naturally is kind of yellow and has some impurities or dirt in it. And I learned that there's a thing called glass bead blasting. So on the right, the contact lens tray that is blasted, but is a little bit whiter and purer in color. That one is blasted with glass beads instead of sand. And on the right-hand side, you see my kind of labeled experiment of putting light behind the different kinds of blasting of the contact lens trays. This project had a whole lot of soldering. It was, what was it, 125, maybe 625 by 25. So I think it's 625 LEDs in total, and each one needed their own wiring harness to connect back to that circuit board. And so I was soldering all the time. I'm soldering on my balcony, you see in the picture on the upper left. And then I enlisted a couple of friends, Nikita and Pat, to help me solder here in the picture on the right. Slowly, as I accumulated the LEDs, I could kind of literally see the picture taking shape. So this is a demo of just a camera view being played on a pixelated camera view being played on the screen. And as I mentioned, it's ocean waves playing. So I filmed various scenes of ocean waves. I went kind of up and down the coast in LA trying to get the right kind of ocean waves, and I eventually chose one of them, and that's what's being played on it. So that's this piece, Polymer. And the last piece I'll show you is kind of related to Polymer. This one is not finished yet. It doesn't have a title. I haven't settled on the content that's playing on it yet, but I think hopefully it's still worth talking about. So it's another low-res LED panel project, but it's larger than that last one. This is another view of what it looks like. Depending on what you play on it, of course, it'll play that color or animation. So it can play different colors. It's LEDs again, and it's using a software called Touch Designer, which some of you might have heard of. It's pretty popular nowadays for all kinds of multimedia, media art applications. And instead of the contact lenses, this project, I made my own custom light diffusers. So these, I'll talk about them a little bit more in depth, but these are cardboard shells that hide and simultaneously hide the light, the LED, as well as diffusing the light. So here we go. So I haven't settled on what to play on it yet, or what kind of content. So right now, this is like a particle animation that I came up with color changes. And you can see that the cardboard shells soften the light and they hide and obscure the LEDs, which is kind of what I was going for. I was going for like a hazy, pointillist experience, and something that would be able to play a coherent image, but to make it less obvious and less apparent. Some other patterns that I've come up with, and then this is what it looks like, with people around it, just for scale. And the piece actually, aside from the light that you see on the surface, it actually throws a lot of light around too. So it has a bit of a kind of like a light source function as well. So this system, I don't think of this as just one piece or one panel. It's a panel system that theoretically could be, in this case, it's 4 panels large, or it could be, what is this, 10 panels, 12 panels large. And, it could be as large as the computer could support, the computer and the hardware. Unlike the polymer contact lens project, which each LED was individually wired, I belatedly discovered the existence of, well, at this time, they were readily available, addressable LEDs. So it's like, essentially, the hardware is like Christmas lights. So they're all physically strung together on the same wire. It's just that there's some chips, and at each end of the long string, there's data, a data connection, which can individually light up and animate each LED along the string. So it saved me a lot of soldering in this project. Here's an early test where I took those LEDs and just ran a test pattern. Here's a screenshot of Touch Designer, and then here you see those 2 circles and the kind of moving blue beam. Again, an early version of getting what's called pixel mapping to get these LEDs to map out a coherent image. And so in this early version, I was showing that the LEDs were just bundled up in these kind of cardboard holsters that I made. And after that, I knew I wanted to make a kind of screen. So I made a rough foam core screen with a square grid, and you see those LEDs punched into the screen, into the foam core surface. And then I started making, in this case, paper versions of these shells that I wanted to develop. And again, it was an iterative process where moving the back row is the first one on the left side, it goes left to right. So I started with paper and it did kind of a pretty simple geometric shape. And for a while, I thought of using a reflective material, which you see in a couple of examples. And it goes back to that Mylar that I was using earlier in school, the reflective Mylar. So this is like a reflective acrylic plastic, laser cut, bent. And I tried the attaching it to the lights, but right away, again, it was the same result that I got all those years ago in my undergrad experiment, where the reflective material, it reveals too much. You can see the bulb itself and you see the underside reflected, the underside of each panel reflected onto the next one over. And I didn't want that. So I left that idea aside and went back to an opaque material. And I also changed from a square grid. Here you see the square grid. I went to a triangular grid because I felt like, you know, with the geometry of circle packing, you can get a arguably greater density when it's a triangular grid, greater density of pixels. And also, I think geometrically, it's a bit more interesting. The world is full of, I think, square grids, and there's less of these kind of offset triangular grids. Back to sketching, I knew I had this triangular grid, but I didn't know what shape these diffusers would take. So I did some early sketching to try to figure out what shape these diffusers could be. Another early iteration. And again, this was modeled in Rhino, where I evolved the geometry of the piece. This is essentially the final design, and then I unfolded it, and I made a cutting file. And for prototyping, at least, I bought myself one of these home cutting machines that you can get in at like Michael's craft store. And it's got a blade cutter. It's not a laser cutter. It's like a laser cutter, but with a blade, a physical blade. And so for my earlier or mid-stage prototyping, I did these cuts in cardstock, and that's what these shells look like. Also started making these panels, laser cut acrylic. They have the triangular grid. And as I mentioned earlier, these panels are meant to butt up against each other to make a potentially infinite surface. And there's magnets. I put a place on the side of each panel for magnets to go. You see the magnet at the bottom of this photo here. And so the magnets themselves don't hold up the whole thing, but when you're screwing it together, having the magnets clip the panels together helps with the alignments and the actual drilling that to drill it into the wall. This is what the wiring looked like on the backside. This is another drawing of, so there's a lot of LEDs, and when you're doing a pixel mapping project, at least the way I was, you have to keep track of, each LED has a number and you have to keep track of them, and they're sequential. And the coding that you do in Touch Designer or whatever program you use has to understand the number of each LED in the field, in the layout. So this was my diagram, just to remind myself which LED was what and how that would work with the Touch Designer software. And it's ongoing. It's showing a photo laid out on these pixels. So material effects, again, this, I think, hopefully will show the kind of animation and the effects that you can get by playing a video or an animation. You have the light source is changing, of course, from the animation, but then you also get the gradient shading from the light to the kind of darkened pointy corner of each shell, of each scale there. So I think it creates a kind of visual interest and derived from the geometry and the nature of the materials that's being used. So these shells, again, is another kind of sweatshop that I set up. The final versions were laser cut. I sent them out to a laser cutting service bureau. And there's a lot of, like all my projects, unfortunately, there's a lot of hand labor to cut out, fold, and glue these shells together. On the right is my friend Eugene, who very nicely helped me do some of the handwork for these shells. I'll show you a little tool that I made. So those shells need to be folded. And I thought it might be quicker to fold it against a physical mold. So I 3D modeled and got 3D printed a mold that I could press each cardboard cutout into and then start bending. And then there's a male to the mold, a male mold, and there's a female mold, and then they kind of sandwich on top of each other. And you squish it down, and then you get a, hopefully a final folded version. It still needs to be glued by hand, but at least the folding was made a little bit faster through that 3D printed tool. Some more assembly shots here. And then the shells finally get glued. My projects are kind of a mix of high tech and low tech. And this is definitely low tech. It's tacky glue or white glue, gluing these laser cut cardboard shells onto each panel. And then the final result looks like this. So here's one of my default animations that I've made, particle animation. Here's another one showing this kind of directional chevrons. Here's another one. And you can also play photos, of course. It's kind of low-res pointillist photos. And so at this point, I haven't decided what to play on it yet, which you would think is kind of an important thing in an art project. But I kind of treated this as, at least so far, I've treated it as a material exploration, which so far has led me to this. And then now I think pretty soon I'm going to change gears and start to think about what is appropriate to play on a surface like this to take advantage of the kind of image blurring properties, as well as the kind of light glow. So this has been a long, thanks, those of you who are still here, thanks for sticking around. In conclusion, I'll say that my projects are very laborious, and there's a level of frustration that's inherent with making physical projects, especially physical projects that have digital hardware and coding. And you never know when electronic hardware is going to fail on you, or when shipping is going to lose part of your project materials, or when there's failures can happen all over the place, and it's just hard and painstaking to make these kind of projects to begin with. But I like to think that the struggle is worth it, because the results, I think the results that I get are arguably different than some other media art projects. Like I said, compared to screen-based projects or projection-based projects, this one has a degree of materiality, and some of them have a spatial component as well. And so it engages with, the material conditions, site conditions, potentially interrelationships between participants, like you saw in that fiber piece, and how those kids play together with each other. Some degree of human senses are involved, sight, touch. And then some of these projects are at the bodily scale, like when you walk into those fibers. So I think with all these things combined together, it hopefully produces results that I think are useful and successful. Thank you. Thanks for coming to the end with me. And if ever you want to see more of my projects, you can see them there at my website or on Instagram. And you can reach out to me there as well, email or Instagram. Thank you.